The Japanese have really embraced Western-style high fantasy, and they have put their own spin on it. Through anime, manga, and light novels, there is a huge array of stories that can be an inspiration for any fantasy RPG player or GM. One of the older ones now is the record of the Lodoss War, Chronicles of the Heroic Knight. It is an anime that is both a continuation and a somewhat rebooting of the original record of Lodoss War. The original stood out as a great entry in the high fantasy genre. The sequel, which was released in 1998, consists of 27 episodes and is based on Ro Mizuno's fantasy novels. These were inspired by the author's tabletop gaming experiences. This practice of a tabletop experience later being written down as a story is not an uncommon progression in light novels, manga, and anime. The series keeps its very well-crafted world and has a sense of epic events about it. On first viewing in 1999, I preferred it to the original. Having watched both again in 2024, I feel there were some narrative issues in the later that have adversely affected the structure and overall experience. Ultimately, however, I do still feel it is a show well worth watching. The good and the bad. The setting is one of the show's greatest strengths. Its inspirations are classic high fantasy and AD&D, and there is a lot to unpack. Lodoss has a deep narrative filled with detailed kingdoms, ruins, ancient mysteries, mythical creatures, monsters, the supernatural, and the idea of special heroes, much like an RPG character. These all contribute to the enjoyable story and make it recognizable to any fan of RPGs or high fantasy. Lodoss has been in a long-standing conflict between good and evil, and even in times of peace, the knowledge that conflict could reignite is a strong motivator for the heroes. The inclusion of themes like destiny, honor, duty, and sacrifice enhances the grand scale of the story. There is a lot of lore about the heroes, places, and religions. This helps to tie the overall setting and the characters together. There is a mix of magic, ritual, action, intrigue, and mythology. The new series reintroduces some returning characters as well as introducing some new ones. Pan, who was reckless, brave, and headstrong in the original, has now grown into a wiser and true knight. Deedlit is still with him, and while her love is clear, it is never really shown if Pan is fully aware of it. Spark is the main new character, but of them, Tanner, Leaf, and Garrick are the most interesting and do help to elevate Spark's storyline. A big theme of the original series is personal growth, often through hardship, and that is continued here. The antagonists, particularly Ashram and Wagnard, are well designed and provide powerful threats that challenge the heroes, and they cannot be ignored. Unlike its more focused predecessor, Chronicles of the Heroic Knight does offer a much larger view of the setting, politics, and its conflicts. It also adds much more to how individuals become kings or queens. It includes larger story arcs, which give a broader feel to the scope of the setting. The series soundtrack is composed by Kaoru Wada, and is surprisingly epic for an anime. The orchestral pieces have recurring themes, reminiscent of pieces that might feel more at home in live-action movies. Everything from the opening song to its end credits speak volumes as to the quality and vision of the musical score. When considering when this was produced, it is well ahead of its time and still stands up very well today. The not as good. Chronicles of the Heroic Knight is longer and larger than the original, and while this does open the opportunity to show more involved stories, it also creates some uneven pacing. The series begins with a recap of the events from the original series. This is somewhat redundant, but oddly, it also seems to forget some of the original characters' actions. The new series certainly does expand the story, but it often lacks the same level of focus and storytelling of the original. Some of the storylines are expanded unnecessarily, leading to periods where the plot fails to move and some episodes feel like they contain filler material. Possibly the strangest decision was to shift the protagonist role from Pan to Spark about halfway through the series. This change feels somewhat abrupt as well, as it is a retelling of the original series. In that, Pan was a brash young warrior full of bravado, but with little brain. He learned what it means to be a knight, a leader, and what his role in the world was. It was a good arc. But Spark's story is just a bit too close to the same thing. Spark has also not been as popular a character, possibly because we already have seen his arc enacted by Pan. An inconsistent animation quality And while I can forgive this one, it is certainly true that the series' art and animation is inconsistent. This could well be down to time and cost. Some of the characters and setting designs are very simple and others are quite detailed. This is most obvious during action sequences during which animation will vary from full motion to static images. Sometimes the motion of characters or horses walking can be quite poor when seen at a distance. The backdrops can be excellent, but other times they can feel somewhat uninspired. This mix can make the series feel a bit old. Like many anime series, this one has an ensemble cast rather than a singular main character. The downside to this is that not all of them receive the treatment they deserve. There is also the shift of focus from one character to another. Pan was a big part of the original series, and as this one started with him, it did feel that it would continue his story, now that he is a more mature and capable knight. Instead, it shifts to Spark's story, which in many ways parallels Pan's, as we've said. While stories that remind a wiser character of where they started can be quite good, in this case it was ground already well travelled. Deedlet's role is possibly the worst. It focuses on her relationship with Pan and doesn't include any compelling additions to her character. How will she deal with Pan aging and dying well before her? What unique elven qualities, both good and bad, could affect their relationship? None of these questions are really explored. The antagonists, while intriguing and having nice character designs, do sometimes lack complexity. The only one whose story does get a little more detail is Ashram. Yet even then it's a bit hollow. The main villain is Wagnard, and he just wants power, and lots of it, and more of it, and just a tad bit more of it. It makes his character somewhat one-note. While Chronicles of the Heroic Knight pays homage to classic fantasy tropes, it occasionally feels overly reliant on clichés. The narrative's predictability and adherence to genre conventions may disappoint viewers seeking innovative storytelling. The series' RPG-inspired structure, while charming, can feel formulaic, particularly for audiences familiar with similar works. Despite its flaws, though, we cannot ignore that this series came out in 1998. It is not a modern series, but it still has its strengths, and the series is a gentle entry into Japanese fantasy for anyone interested in exploring the genre. It is not reliant on gore or sex to try and make it compelling, and is also a straight-up high fantasy series. No reincarnation from another world to be found here. While it certainly relies on many fantasy tropes and ideas of the day, that does play into its strength as a classic fantasy story. Anyone who has played a tabletop RPG might feel a positive familiarity, nostalgia for an adventure that they may have taken part in themselves. It has helped set the stage for many series that came after it, and quite possibly influenced other creators to look at world building and music as key elements that should not be ignored. While it does have flaws, it is still a fun and entertaining series for anyone who loves high adventure. We give it 7 dead goblins out of 10.